How do you go from being an enthusiastic shareholder in Facebook to being one of its most vocal critics? Roger McNamee will be here to talk about his new book, Zucked. Looking for a good thriller? Charles Finch joins us to talk about the season's best thrillers, literary, domestic, and otherwise. Plus, we'll talk about what we and the wider world are reading. This is the Book Review Podcast from the New York Times. I'm Pamela Paul. Roger McNamee joins us now from Silicon Valley, very appropriately, because his book is called Zucked, Waking Up to the Facebook Catastrophe. Roger, thanks for being here.
Pamela, it's a delight for me to be here.
So this is not your first book. You've written a couple of other books, but writing books is not your main line of work. What do you do for a living when you're not writing?
I spent 34 years as an analyst and investor in America's technology industry, mostly in Silicon Valley. I am also a professional musician, which I've done since my years in college. And that both of those are activities that I take very, very seriously. And for the past 2 years, I have converted from being an investor in technology to being a critic of companies that I was part of helping to build and which I love dearly, but which sadly are now unintentionally causing great harm.
What was it 2 years ago that caused that shift? Or was it sudden, or was it a slow building thing?
It was sudden. I was on vacation with my wife in January of 2016. So in the run-up to the New Hampshire primary, and I saw things on Facebook that were completely inappropriate, that were ostensibly associated with the Bernie Sanders campaign. And then a month later, I saw that there was a company expelled from Facebook because they had used the advertising tools to essentially spy on people who were interested in Black Lives Matter, and then they sold the data to police departments. Over the course of that year, there were a number of other things that, again, showed that bad actors were using the advertising tools and the business model of Facebook to harm innocent people. And, that was something I was completely unprepared for. I'd been a cheerleader for the company. I'd actually been involved as an advisor to Mark Zuckerberg and Sheryl Sandberg. I had helped to bring them together in the early days of Facebook. And so I just didn't anticipate there would ever be a dark side. And when I saw it, it initially shocked me, and I thought this must be isolated. But as the year went on, there were more and more of these things. And so I reached out to Mark and Sheryl before the election to alert my friends to what I thought was something where they were the innocent victim. And in a sense, they were the victim, but it was more complicated than that. And so I've spent the past 2 years first learning about it and now increasingly trying to make people aware of something that I never thought I would see, that I'm quite certain almost no one anticipated.
You say it was more complicated than that. How aware were they, and what were the complications?
I don't actually know whether they were aware of the Russians' attempt to manipulate Facebook. I'm quite certain that they were complicit in the use of Facebook by the Trump campaign to suppress votes in the run-up to the election, especially in the final weeks before the election. But to me, all of that was explainable as in life we make mistakes, that they may have been exuberant about what was a remarkably innovative approach that Stephen Bannon brought to the use of social media in an election. And so I'm prepared to excuse that part, and because I know these people, and they aren't bad people. In fact, I think they're good people, but they also are very committed to a singular vision. And I fear that success blinded them and caused them to essentially think that the mission was so important that any means necessary to get there would be justifiable. And what bothers me most is what has happened since evidence came to light that demonstrates the harm. If you think about all the people who've been killed in the genocide in Myanmar, if you think about the people who've been killed in Sri Lanka, if you think about the impact on the Brexit referendum in the United Kingdom, if you think about the stuff just this week, we've had disclosure that Facebook consciously essentially caused little kids, 13-year-olds, 14-year-olds, to buy product on Facebook using in-app purchases. And then even when it was disclosed, it sort of kept at it. And then we've had this example of this new what they called a research product. It was trying to harvest all the data to pay people, yes, but to harvest data in a way that was obviously inappropriate given what we know about privacy now. And to me, it's this continued insistence that they are the only ones entitled to render a judgment on their business. That's what bothers me.
So you went from being a mentor to Mark Zuckerberg, sort of steering Sheryl Sandberg, right? Recommending her to Mark Zuckerberg to take a job at Facebook rather than go to the Washington Post at the time, and calling them up and saying like, hey guys, looks like there's a problem here, to writing a book called Zucked. I mean, presumably you're not on those same terms with them as you were. Like, was there something that happened between that initial call and when you got to, okay, I really need to write a book and expose all of this that happened?
Pamela, that's exactly the right question to ask. So I reached out to them via email. What happened was I was invited to write an op-ed for a technology blog called Recode, and to share my concerns. Again, this is when I was convinced that Facebook was the victim. And my wife, Ann, pointed out that it would be most effective if I shared it with Mark and Sheryl before publishing. And so I did that. And they got right back to me, but they very politely and firmly dismissed my concerns as isolated and things they'd already taken care of. But they graciously passed me along to one of their lieutenants, somebody I knew very well and liked very much. And I had long conversations with him. When the election happened, everything changed for me because at that point it was hard to escape the conclusion that Facebook had played a material role in the outcome, and that the role that they had played would not be something that a normal person in a normal time would accept if it happened to their candidate. And so that was the beginning. But again, I thought they were the victim. So I spent almost 3 months begging Facebook to do what Johnson & Johnson did when somebody poisoned bottles of Tylenol, to recognize that they had a duty to protect the people who use their product. And if that meant an economic sacrifice, so be it, because they were in a business based on trust. And if they lost the trust of their users, the business would be worthless. And so I spent 3 months doing that, just very quietly. I never published the op-ed. And they just weren't interested. They just had no interest at all. So I spent 6 months trying to understand the problem. That's when I realized it wasn't just Facebook. It was actually Google and YouTube and Instagram and WhatsApp and Twitter, that it's actually driven by a business model that, when applied to internet platforms, can be used to manipulate attention for profit, and that when you manipulate attention, you create a model where bad actors can actually manipulate what people think, what they believe, and what they do. And in doing so, they created great harm. That essentially, it was a form of capitalism we've never seen before. Every bit as profound as Gutenberg inventing the printing press, or the mass commercialization of electricity and the automobile, where there's a before and an after, and that when you go into one of those changes, there's no way to be prepared. That the vocabulary we use to describe privacy doesn't fit this situation. It's a form of extraction. This is one of those moments where a wiser group of people would do what Henry Ford did. Henry Ford was not a great man in many respects, but he understood something profound, that mass market automobiles were going to change life forever in profound ways, and that if he wanted to do that in a way that didn't destroy society, he had to make sure that the people who built the cars could participate in the benefits created by that invention. And so he paid them better than ever before and gave them better working conditions. And in a sense, he smoothed the path for this massive disruption. And that is something that Google and Facebook could have done and still could do. It would require massive changes to their business model. But these people are so rich and so successful that this is one of those moments where they could step forward and do the right thing. And I wrote this book because I realized that this transition is so complicated that it needed someone to step forward and say, it's not really about technology. It's really about people. It's really about values. And there are things you can do to protect yourself, to protect your children, and to protect everybody you know. And so it's a very hopeful book in that sense.
When you say that it's a different sort of model of capitalism, one that we've never seen before, are you referring to the fact that it essentially everyone who is a user is in a way an unpaid employee offering up their services, i.e. their own content, their own personal information for free, and they are not being paid to do this, nor are they paying Facebook to do this, so there's not really any kind of reciprocal expectation. I mean, is that what it is, or is there something else?
That's how it started. But now it's evolved to something that is much more like an extraction industry, like energy, where essentially the technology is very clever. Because of the real-time feedback, when you're on Facebook or you're on YouTube or Google or Instagram, you think that you're looking at photographs or sending updates to friends. In reality, you're competing against this massive artificial intelligence that has almost perfect information about you and has different goals than you have. It's trying to extract economic value wherever it can find it. And so what began as treating you as the product has now treated you as the fuel. And this is really dangerous because we're talking about products that created habits that evolved into addictions. One of the things I ask people when I'm in a group, I say, so when you wake up in the morning, do you check your smartphone before you pee or while you're peeing? Right? We're all addicted to our smartphone. And, those are the only two answers. Hardly anybody waits any longer than 5 minutes to check the phone in the morning. And that's less about the smartphone than it is about the applications that are on them and the extreme convenience that the smartphone presents. It's always there. And these apps have trained us to use every idle moment, right? It basically says you shouldn't just daydream. You need to check your notifications, see what's going on. And there's something deeply wrong with that in the sense that our objectives as human beings are, very personalized, very individual. And yet we cannot resist the addictive powers of these applications. And we essentially use their convenience and their fun as a justification for letting these people exploit us. And my point here is there's nothing wrong with social media that you couldn't fix with a business model that was less predatory. And so my hope is with the book is that people understand that as individuals, as human beings, we have more power than we realize. In the vernacular of Facebook and Google, we are users. That's a term that comes from illegal drugs. They don't treat us as human beings. They treat us as a metric, a path to success. And that is fundamentally flawed. And the thing everybody should understand is as human beings formerly known as users, we have power. We have political power because the policymakers in the United States and Europe recognize that there's something deeply wrong here, that they have a duty to do something and they need us to push them to do it.
You mentioned, users versus human beings. Is the idea of Facebook as connecting people, connecting human beings, is that merely a cynical marketing line, or at some point was that actually a real belief?
They genuinely believe that connecting people is so inherently a good thing that it justifies whatever means they need to implement to get it done. Here's where the problem is. It has long been known that when networks get to be large, anonymity, if it's allowed, enables bad actors, bullies, if you will, to dominate that network. And the key to Facebook, when I first met Mark, he did two things that nobody had done before. He required authenticated real identity, which had they implemented it and retained it throughout, would have been very helpful to protecting people. And secondly, he gave people the ability to control the distribution of their content, in effect, to control their privacy. Now, as the company grew and the economic incentives changed, they relaxed the authentication process for identity so that now bad actors can be anonymous and can do great harm. And secondly, they essentially shifted the business model to something called metadata, which is data about data. It's where you are when you're checking in. It's are you moving, not moving? Are you in a car? Are you on a smartphone? It's who did you connect with when? It's not the photos you put up. It's the stuff that has real value to advertisers. And the business model is based on that. And Facebook gives you no control over that at all. So that when Mark went in front of Congress and said, hey, we let you control your data, that was factually correct. It's also completely irrelevant because that's not what drives the business model.
Mark Zuckerberg and Sheryl Sandberg, they're no dummies. They must be aware of all of the negative consequences of Facebook. How much of it has been intentional? How much of it is unintended consequences? And then how much of the problem is awareness of all of this, but not acting on it?
Pamela, I wish I knew the answer. Throughout this process, I have convinced myself that we're dealing with the unintended consequences of well-intended strategies. There is a lot of evidence now that not everyone at Facebook has good intentions. There was a story a few months ago about Facebook hiring a firm called Definers to spread basically conspiracy theories against critics, specifically Apple Computer and George Soros. And the one against George Soros was anti-Semitic. And it's really hard to excuse that because a culture that would hire a political opposition research firm to go after critics is not a culture that has much moral fiber. And so I'm deeply distressed because I believe they continue to deny the fundamental issue, which is that their business practices, their culture, and their business model together create this toxic stew, this form of capitalism that the Harvard professor Shoshana Zuboff calls surveillance capitalism, and that this is something that was originated by Google, and Google is the most extreme practitioner. And it just happens that I was closer to Facebook than Google. I saw the problem first on Facebook. So I wrote the book. In a sense, in the book, I'm Jimmy Stewart in Rear Window. I saw something wrong in a situation where I was not expecting it. And I kept pulling on the thread. And I used the narrative arc of my discovery to share what I learned with the reader. And throughout, I was like a Jimmy Stewart character in an Alfred Hitchcock movie. I was really naive. And I wanted to believe the best. And it's gotten harder and harder to do that with time because there's so obviously a better way to handle this than the way they're handling it now.
Mm-hmm.
And, the people I knew so well, the people that I worked with from 2006 to 2009 were way better than this. And I don't know what's happened. And I haven't talked to either Mark or Sheryl or heard from them since October of 2016. No one at Facebook has reached out to me since February of 2017. And so roughly 2 years without any communication at all. And that is really shocking because if they wanted to fix the problems, the first step is to reach out to your critics and understand their perception of the problem.
Do you no longer have any financial
Oh, no, quite the opposite. My largest personal investment position is in Facebook stock, which I've consciously held because I don't want anybody to be confused about what my motivations are. I want to fix the company. I want to end the practice of surveillance capitalism. And I'm prepared to take the same risk that they're taking for as long as I am making this case. I didn't want anybody to sit there and say, well, he sold the stock, so he's just bashing the company. No, I'm getting creamed with everybody else.
What would fix it?
I believe you have to change the business model. There's been a lot of talk about changing out the people, and I think that's misguided. If you were to put new people into Facebook or Google without changing the business model, the problems would persist. If you change the business model, if you move away from surveillance as a driver of the business, if you move away from extraction, if you start to treat the people who use your product as human beings entitled to self-determination, that is a change so profound that Mark and Sheryl could stay. I mean, you don't need to change the management team. In fact, it would be better if you didn't, because Mark and Sheryl are the only people with the moral authority to fix Facebook. If they don't do it, then the government has to do it, and that will obviously be a blunt instrument of regulation because the only hope here is that we have to change them so profoundly that, if they aren't willing to do it themselves, then the government's going to have to step in.
Earlier, you said that if you don't have trust, right, then you don't have a business, you don't have success, going back to that Johnson & Johnson analogy. And it would seem that at this stage, after all of these problems that have surfaced, they've been in the news, people are aware of the various privacy transgressions and other mistakes that Facebook has made, whether deliberately or inadvertently, over the past 2 years. And yet, in the paper today, headline is Facebook's profits and revenues climb as it gains more users. So how do you reconcile that? I mean, many people seem that not to trust Facebook anymore, and yet it's thriving.
I can't be certain what's going on, but I have a couple hypotheses. The one piece that we know for certain is that Facebook has aggregated the largest community of human beings in history. And for advertisers, there is literally no substitute. So the fact that they had record revenues and earnings is not a surprise. They're loading far more ads into their news feeds than they used to. So it makes sense, particularly in the holiday quarter, that there would have been record revenues and profits. So that part doesn't surprise me. The increase in users is the place where I'm actually kind of surprised.
Are you surprised or skeptical?
Well, I'm going to say surprised. You can decide after I give you my explanation whether some skepticism is part of the surprise. They said to us at one point last year that they rejected, I believe it was 1 billion inauthentic accounts during the prior year. So when you have that many inauthentic accounts coming in, you have a lot of control over the user count that you report. And you might let some small percentage slip through if that were convenient to the business. I think we've learned with Twitter, and I think we suspect with Facebook, that there are a lot of inauthentic accounts. How many is a percentage? I couldn't say, but a large enough number that it's not crazy to imagine that the gross number that they put out, 2.3 billion, may not reflect the actual number of human beings interacting with the system.
On another social media platform, primarily on Twitter, you will often have these groups that aggregate, that congregate, and mobilize against an advertiser because of some form of media some platform that they are advertising on and problems they have with it. So whether it's because someone on that program said something that was racist, and so users then go after the advertisers and say, well, how can you advertise on this program? The anchor said something racist or something anti-Semitic or was involved in a Me Too related issue, and then the advertisers will pull out. Why has that not happened with Facebook? If there are so many people who have become suspicious of Facebook, have lost their trust in it, or have become critics of Facebook, why is this not rippled out to affect the advertising?
It is beginning to. There were stories a few months ago, particularly focused on Instagram, where advertisers had noticed that there would be posts advocating the sale of illegal drugs or related to terrorist organizations that were adjacent to the ads they were paying for on Instagram. And this is not a small problem. This is actually a very large problem. Here's the challenge for advertisers. They have to go where the audience is. This is the same problem that publishers, including the New York Times, face when they're dealing with social media. Social media has very cleverly used convenient tools and convenient fun applications on the internet to gather the entire audience that would consume content or purchase the products of an advertiser. And that's allowed them to dictate to both content companies and advertisers a business deal that is completely one-sided, favoring the internet platforms. And it's been very hard to fight back because there is no direct substitute any longer for Facebook. The audience is there. You can't aggregate enough newspapers, television, and radio cost effectively to compete with the pricing of Facebook. And that will change in time. And Pamela, the point that I want to really emphasize is that the congressional hearings, the extraordinary journalism of the past year, has made people aware that there's a problem. But the problem is actually very complex. And very few people understand yet how it relates directly to them. And, I am completely sympathetic with that. I've spent my whole life studying this industry. I spent the last 3 years studying this exact problem. It's really complicated. And I wrote the book to demystify it, to make the explanation palatable to the parents of teenagers. That, very simply put, this isn't actually a technology problem. You have to get past that. They use that like a magician waves their hand, right? It's designed to distract. You have to get to the heart of the thing, which is that they've inserted themselves into our lives in a privileged position, and they've abused the trust we've built up over 50 years in prior generations of technology to essentially extract value from us without our awareness, to change the ideas we believe in, to recommend things for us to buy. And here's the scary part. The problem we all face right now is a new generation of technology in the form of artificial intelligence and the Internet of Things is coming to market and becoming mainstream. And these technologies are going to take the surveillance capitalism model into new places, all around the house, in your car, everywhere you go. And with artificial intelligence, they're going to start to replace people in their jobs. They're going to also start replacing humans as decision makers. And the flaw that companies like Google, like Microsoft, like Amazon have had in their approach to artificial intelligence is that they use data sets from the real world without adjusting for the implicit bias we see every day. And so when there is a mortgage approval application, redlining is built in because it was in the real world and they didn't adjust for that. If you see AI that's used to winnow out resumes, you find bias based on gender and race built in because that exists in the real world. And with artificial intelligence, there's no reason why you cannot get rid of that implicit bias. But you need wise people in charge, people who understand that that's important, people who, like Henry Ford, realize that these are human beings. And if you don't treat them well, the consequences are going to be disastrous. And so I believe that we have to use the power we have as human beings, both to influence our politicians and to change the way that we use these applications. They depend on our attention. If we withdraw a portion of our attention, we can have an impact. And we need to do this collectively. And so in writing the book, I'm giving everyone a path for how to do that.
All right, then. Well, that's a great note to end on. Hopefully people are paying attention. The book, again, is called Zucked, Waking Up to the Facebook Catastrophe by Roger McNamee. Roger, thanks so much for being here.
Pamela, what a joy. Thank you very much.
So here's a request for our listeners. I get lots of feedback from you, some complaints, lots of kind words. Really appreciate it. You can always reach me directly at books@nytimes.com. I will write back. But you can also, if you feel moved to do so, review us on any platform where you download the podcast, whether that's iTunes or Stitcher or Google Play or somewhere else. Please feel free to review us and, of course, email us at any time. Charles Finch joins us now from LA. He is a literary critic, a novelist in his own right, author of the forthcoming The Vanishing Man. And this week, he reviews the season's thrillers for us. Charlie, thanks for being here.
My pleasure.
I'm going to run down all of these titles, and then we'll just talk about them a little bit one by one and as a group, because I always like to know which ones we should actually read from among these books. So the books that you reviewed are The Lost Man by Jane Harper, As Long as We Both Shall Live by Joanne Chaney, The Plotters by Unsoo Kim, Watching You by Lisa Jewell, The Current by Tim Johnston, and The Paragon Hotel by Lindsay Fay. All right, that's a lot. I want to start with the first one, which is highly anticipated third book by Jane Harper. Her first book was a huge bestseller, The Dry. This one is called The Lost Man. And on the cover it says, 3 brothers, 1 death, no answers. Tell us about this book.
3 brothers, no, gosh, I need to steal that. That's really good. Yeah, The Lost Man, I really enjoyed this book, and I was a little bit worried because she came out of the gates really well with The Dry, which was about a town that hadn't experienced rain in 2 years in Australia. And then her second book was slightly weaker, but The Lost Man is like a roar back to form. It's basically about this guy who dies circling a grave, trying to stay in its very meager shadow. And she's an interesting writer. She was born in the UK, but moved to Australia when she's 8. And she sort of has her nose pressed up against the window of the outback. She's like, what the heck is going on here with these people who live out in this 110-degree heat, miles and miles from each other? And her characters have this kind of like epic yearning that you associate with the outback. It's kind of like The Last Untamed Place or something. And so to set a murder mystery there, I think, a thriller, it gives you a lot of juice. And she's a very gifted, laconic, kind of smart writer. So I love that book.
Oh, good. Okay. Let's go to the next one. Joanne Chaney, As Long as We Both Shall Live.
Yes, Joanne Chaney. So, I mean, you know this better than anyone, but when you write about books, you get a lot of books. And for a few years now, I feel like it's been with domestic suspense, like when Harry gets the letters from Hogwarts and they start flying through the chimney and stuff. I mean, I feel like 2 or 3 come a day. So I grade on a bit of a curve against domestic suspense because it's so ubiquitous right now. But this was a really good riff on the sort of Gone Girl, Paula Hawkins genre.
So is there an unreliable narrator?
Oh, more than one. And and a marriage that is sort of a sociopath off, which is always fun.
Okay, I love the premise of this. I feel like, again, I've read this before in its way. I think there was a domestic thriller, psychological thriller last year where you had a honeymoon couple and one ends up dead situation that was on a beach. And here they are. They're not on a beach. They're in the mountains, Matt and Marie. What happens without any plot spoilers, please?
So basically, Matt comes sprinting down the mountain after this picturesque hike they've taken, saying, "My wife is dead. My wife is dead. She's fallen off of a cliff." And so naturally, as readers, we're like, "Well, okay." But, we see that where this is going. But I give Gillian Flynn a lot of credit because I think we're all living in her wake, and now smart readers know to mistrust that first instinct and be like, well, Matt is the obvious choice. So is it Marie, or are we going to double back to Matt? It's kind of one of those books.
And did it deliver?
Yeah, totally. It's like a really strong kind of keep you up at night. I don't think it'll change anyone's life, but it's like if you're going to the beach and want to get out of the polar vortex and just read, this is like a great just like beach read.
Okay, I'm going to take this one. I will put it on the to read list. This is what happens when you come on and we talk about thrillers, which I remember we did a couple years back, where I feel like the life I want to live is just, I don't know, being either in a snug winter cabin or maybe even better yet on a beach in LA, like with all of these books and no work to do.
I know, right?
But they can't all be that good. I don't want to lead anyone. These are probably all the best of the crop because you went through many books to select these 6. But tell us a little bit about Eun-Soo Kim's The Plotters.
So this is like a real left turn from the 2 other books we've talked about. Eun-Soo Kim is an interesting writer. This is his first book to be published in English, but he has a pretty sterling literary reputation in South Korea. And he's this sort of Brian De Palma-esque writer where there's a lot of splatter. This is a book about a version of South Korea. It's not totally clear how close to the current version, where there's just tons of assassinations. A character says, like, if you tap a mountainside with a bulldozer, bodies will come pouring out. And it stars, or I guess its hero, is an assassin named Rasang who suspects that the gun might get turned on him pretty soon. And so if you like a kind of really out there Tarantino-esque kind of thing, with
meaning
a lot of
like ultra violent?
Yeah, exactly. It's kind of like, he's constantly inventing new ways for people to have fights and stuff like that. So it's a little bit less psychological and a little bit more grindhouse. But I kind of really found it interesting, and it has sort of this fun critique of capitalism underneath it, which, maybe Howard Schultz should read it.
All right. I'm going to try not to judge a book by its cover, but I'm guessing that Lisa Jewell's Watching You is very different in terms of maybe the violence factor or the gore.
Totally, yeah. There's a little blood. There's a kind of a tasteful amount of blood. She's like, as I say in the review, almost the opposite of Unsoo Kim, where he's all over the place. She's just like a seasoned professional. I think she's written something like 15 or 16 books. And it reminded me a bit, reading this book, which I actually really enjoyed, of the Malcolm Gladwell idea of, virtuosity taking 10,000 hours of practice, which has sort of been mocked into submission a little, but contains an obvious kernel of truth, which is that if you do something a lot, you get better at it, whether it's like hitting backhands or poaching eggs or, in her case, writing novels. So she writes this novel about a death on a small street in Bristol and the various people who might know something or might not. And it's kind of really juicy.
It's interesting because with thriller writers, the natural suspicion is actually to think the opposite happens, that the writer has a really good premise for their first novel. They write something, great. And then the second novel, they sort of try to pull it off, maybe don't quite get there. Like you almost fear that there's diminishing returns because they run out of all their good ideas with those first few novels.
Oh, that's interesting. Well, I definitely wouldn't accuse Watching You of being like really original or having anything totally new and splashy to do on the page, but it's just kind of like being in the hands of a pro's pro. She just really knows what she's doing. And so it's like not a novel that's going to, make you think like, oh my gosh, this is a new voice to watch. But if you want to just kind of watch the news tighten around a story, this is the book to read of the six.
All right, let's go to the next one because it's not a second novel, but it's a second novel, sort of suspense novel by this author, Tim Johnson. The book is called The Current. His previous one was Descent. What's this book about?
This is sort of more toward the literary end of the thriller spectrum. And it's set in Minnesota, and it's about two college-age girls who are driving home to see one of their fathers who is sick and who also happens to be the sheriff, and they are maybe murdered or maybe accidentally tipped into an icy river, and one of them dies. And it's the kind of book where I think sometimes we give it too long a line of credit. Like if you write very somber novels set in cold places, that doesn't make you Daniel Woodrell or Charles Portis. But in this case, he's a really gifted writer, Tim Johnston, and he's actually a really surprisingly gifted suspense writer, which not all literary novelists who stoop to genre fiction are.
Well, we of course know there's no such thing as stooping to genre fiction. Let's talk
you
about...
and I know that.
That's
yeah.
right. And we're hopefully persuading many of our listeners as well.
Exactly.
The next book is the last book, The Paragon Hotel by Lindsay Fay. Tell us about this.
Yes, I love this book. Lindsay Fay is like a really fascinating writer. She wrote a version of Jane Eyre called Jane Steele, where Jane Eyre is kind of like a Dexter type who goes around killing people, and she's written some great riffs on the Holmes-Watson canon. And she's just one of those really gifted natural writers. Like you can tell that she thinks and jokes and understands the world by writing, which I love it when I encounter a writer like that. And in this book, which is about sort of a 1920s gangster moll who takes the cross-country train to Portland with a gun shot in her stomach, I sort of forgave some of the plot's less likely twists and turns because I found the voice so enchanting.
All right, so here you leave most listeners, certainly me, in an impossible dilemma because most of us don't have time to read all 6 of these books, right? Unless, I don't know, maybe some people are in that like cozy Vermont cabin or that beach vacation and they actually can. So I want to ask you to do something that I know is extremely difficult to do and you probably hate being asked, but let's kind of rank these in some ways, if you will. Okay, I'm not going to make you go like 1 to 6, but which were the real standouts among these books, if you had to say, for you?
You know, if you read a lot of literary fiction, which I also do, I think you can probably skip the plotters and the current because you can get better versions of those sort of from the literary world. The one that I think will be popular with almost anyone who picks it up is As Long as We Both Shall Live. It's just sort of like a really satisfying domestic suspense marriage thriller in the Lane Moriarty tradition. And then I think The Lost Man is one of those weird books where the first 50 pages you're like, why am I reading this? And then suddenly you're like totally sucked into the undertow. And it just becomes clear that Jane Harper is maybe a cut above these other writers in terms of crafting a thriller and the psychological elements that go into it. She's sort of this prickly, interesting writer. And she's the one whose career I would probably be most, like if this were the stock market, I would be buying Jane Harper stock.
Well, actually, readers of the Times can read a profile of her that we published this week, so we can find out more about her.
An amazing profile, yeah.
How did this compare with The Dry?
I think The Dry is exactly what you were saying earlier. It's like she had a really good idea, a really good concept, and the maybe execution was pretty good, whereas this is like kind of not as good a concept, but her execution is better. So it inverts the strengths of The Dry in a way. It doesn't grab you as by the collar from page one, but her characters really grow and change and become more interesting, and the plot is really kind of like an A-plus plot in terms of like crafting a mystery. So it's interesting to watch a writer like this grow.
And if you're in this purely for the writing, in other words, you might not be a thriller connoisseur, you want something that's a little more literary, maybe a little bit edgier or not necessarily experimental, but maybe playing with the genre a bit, who would you recommend?
Well, so I think the natural answer would probably be Unsu Kim or Tim Johnson, but I'm going to say Lindsay Fay just because I think the Paragon Hotel, every chapter is headed with these amazing facts about the KKK in Oregon. I had no idea it was such a viciously racist state. You associate that with, Mississippi or Alabama.
They're all racist, Charlie.
I know they were all bad, but some pigs were more equal than others. Or so I thought, but Oregon was just as bad as any of these places. And so there's this kind of like, I came out of it feeling like I learned something and like there were lines from the book that I would never forget. So it's not precisely literary, but I just kept feeling drawn back to it as I was reading these books.
All right. Listeners are going to be able to listen to this podcast on February 1st. So we can say your next book is coming out this month. It's The Vanishing Man. Let me give you a few minutes to talk about that book before we let you go.
Oh, you are so kind. The Vanishing Man. So this is a prequel to the series I write about a Victorian detective. And let me think. It's about a lost Shakespeare portrait, and I worked really, really hard on it. And I actually think it's pretty good. I usually come out of it thinking they're bad, but I think this one's pretty good. And
a rousing endorsement from the author.
Well, if you talk to other authors, I think if you gave them truth serum, everyone thinks everything's a shipwreck. So I think it's a fun one. So buy it for yourself and your friends and your pets in hardcover, please, the minute it comes out.
It's not quite a shipwreck.
No, not quite a shipwreck.
All right.
I'm going to put that on the cover.
Charles Finch, always a pleasure to have you here. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Pamela.
Joining us now to talk about what we're reading, my colleagues Lovia Garake, Tina Jordan, and John Williams. Hi, guys.
Hey, Paula. Hi.
All right, Tina, you've been away for a while. Did you get some vacation reading in?
I actually didn't because I was helping my daughter move. And, I took workbooks. What can I say? I was thinking I would relax with something in my daughter's apartment, forgetting she was in medical school, and there's no fun reading there.
Okay. Well, what not fun work reading did you do?
Oh, no. No. I was doing fun work reading.
Okay, good.
I just can't talk about that stuff yet.
All right. Tell us about what you most recently read that you can talk about.
Okay, so I'm reading The Water Cure by Sophie McIntosh, which N.K. Jemisin reviewed for us. It was longlisted for the Man Booker last year, and when I picked it up, I was not sure it was going to be my cup of tea. It's one of those very, very spare dystopian novels, not a wasted word, and it's about a family. Sisters, mother, father, living on an island. I was imagining it off the coast of Washington as I was reading. And something bad has happened in the world, and they're sequestered there. But it's like the family is a little cult. I mean, the father, they're abused by their parents, basically. And they've been raised in such a way that they don't know how to interact with people who are not family. And what's happened in the book at the point where I am is the girl's father's disappeared, and they're pretty sure he's dead. His blood-stained sneaker is washed up on the beach, and some men show up on the island. And I can tell that what's going to happen next is not going to be good.
That sounds good, actually.
It is good, yeah.
Lovia, what about you?
I'm reading A Brief History of Seven Killings by Marlon James, which is very topical, on brand, because, as we know, his new book is coming out. And, I mean, I feel like kind of silly recounting the plot of A Brief History because it's one of those books that I feel like everybody talks about having read or going to read or wanting to read. But essentially, briefly, it's this sort of sweeping historical novel told with a chorus of characters surrounding the 1962 assassination attempt of Bob Marley. I'm only like about 200 pages in. It's like 700 pages. So it's one of those books that, really, I guess when I get halfway through it, I'll feel like I've made some progress, but I haven't as of yet. So, I mean, it's an incredible novel. It's one that I've been intending to read for a while now. And I don't really usually like sort of like novels that have what feels like several hundred characters from different point of views. But I think just, it's really ambitious, but the execution is near perfect. And like I was joking with a friend earlier today, I was like, I'm trying to find the flaw in the book, like why I should put it down. But I haven't yet found a reason. I mean, won the Man Booker Prize in 2015, I think. And basically, the assassination attempt is not really like the crux of the book. Bob Marley is referred to as the singer. What's really interesting is how James sort of uses the people around Marley, or the singer, I should say, to kind of explore the socio-political landscape of Jamaica, its relationship with the United States, the CIA's attempt to upend the left-wing party, and sort of thinking about like poverty and escape and just the interpersonal lives of the character. And there's this one character who I'm really fond of, Nina Burgess, who slept with the singer at one point and sort of is trying to deny that she's not in love with him, but sort of just she stands outside of his complex, trying to get him to come out and see her and to remember her. And is sort of in this denial that she's just probably one of like several women that he slept with. And there's a part where she's standing outside and she says, "I need to go home, but I'm outside here waiting on him. You ever feel like home is the one place you can't go back to? It's like you promise yourself when you get out of bed and combed your hair that this evening, when I get back, I'll be a different woman in a new place. And now you can't go back because the house expects something from you." So that's one of my favorite passages, and I underlined it. And I bring it up because I think in his first novel, Marlon James got a critique that he didn't know how to write women, but the women or Nina specifically, I think is so well written and feels very realistic to me. And so I think it's one of those things where like I'm also very impressed that like a novelist can take that criticism and really work towards it. I'm not like that far in the book, so I can't really say much more about it except for that everybody should read it and it should move off the to read.
I have a question. Do you do that often where you're reading and you're looking for a reason to put a book down? Because like there's that versus looking for a reason to keep reading.
Yeah. Well, I think, because I also like writing and want to be a writer. I sort of try to like, it's probably too analytical. It makes reading a little less fun, but I'm really trying to figure out like the components of a novel and like why I really enjoy reading the book that I'm reading, or like what the writer is doing well and what they're not doing well. And so in that way, I think recently I've been reading a lot of really great novels actually, and I'm trying to figure out like what makes them work in hopes that, I can basically steal. So John, what are you reading?
I'm reading a memoir by the photographer Sally Mann called Hold Still. It was published in 2015. Mann is a Southern photographer who people probably know best through in the early 1990s when she first came to my attention. I was just a teenager, but she became the object of some controversy because she took a series of photographs of her children, her 3 children who lived on this very large acreage of land in Virginia, where she raised them, and kind of a remote place surrounded by a lot of land, so they felt, I think, a little bit apart from society. And she took a lot of pictures of them naked, a lot of pictures of them with injuries or in states of distress, and they were very striking photos, very beautiful. They also caused a lot of tumult. There was a cover article in the New York Times Magazine in 1992 that the headline was "The Disturbing Photography of Sally Mann," and they were published, the photographs, in a big book called Immediate Family, which became a really big seller for such a book.
What was the controversy for those who don't remember?
Well, the controversy was essentially that, people wondered there were so many letters to the editor to the Times Magazine after this piece ran, and the piece itself addressed these issues, which were, some people felt that there was something very lurid about just photographing naked children inherently, that there was some kind of, that this would be inspiration for pederasts. There were feelings that, a mother should be more protective of her children, that the children in the future wouldn't know what to make of these photos and might be scarred by them in some way. And so it all revolved around those issues. She makes, in this book, even though it was published, more than 20 years after that controversy occurred, a lot of the beginning of the book is taken up with a kind of robust defense of herself and of sort of art in general and its prerogatives. She also essentially, though, says, that no, she doesn't know how it's going to affect her children and that is a risk. But she essentially says she would do it all again, knowing what she knows now. The book is really beautifully illustrated, obviously with lots of her photographs, but also the real through line of the book is that she finds in her attic these boxes of information and documents about her family. And so she goes back through her family history, back to her grandfather and her great-grandfather on each side of the family. And there are lots of archival photos that she didn't take that are just great pictures from her family's history and from the South. And the book is really about different things. In some chapters, she's really addressing her life as a photographer. She's great on issues of not just the controversy around those one series of photographs I mentioned, but just in general, the idea of photos, whether they lie or not, whether they accurately depict things, landscape versus portraiture and all those things. And then her family history is completely fascinating. Her grandfather on her father's side invented some cotton ginning technology that made him a multimillionaire. He was very, very generous to people in the South around where he lived. And the prose is sometimes it can get purplish by half a little bit, but she also acknowledges that, and she's also great on what it means to be a Southerner and to sort of romanticize the landscape you live in and the history, even though it's so twisted in some ways. And I'm really loving it. I'm almost done with it. She's at her best, I think she's as good a writer as a photographer, which is really saying something.
Wow.
So that came out about 4 years ago, and I would highly recommend it as both a visual experience and a prose experience. How about you, Pamela? What are you reading?
Well, I'm going to talk about 3 books. I'm going to talk about the one that I finished, the one that I'm really reading, and then a little book that I'm also kind of reading. So I finished finally Barbarian Days by William Finnegan, and I wanted to talk about it just for a moment because I was only at the beginning when we last spoke about it. And it was just as good through the end as it was when I started it. I love books that are about a time and a place that is just no longer accessible, that you're able to get back into that period. And I think for that reason, for me, the best parts of the book were sort of about Hawaii in the 60s and Los Angeles in the 70s and the South Pacific in the 80s. And you get this real sense that you even if you wanted to kind of try to replicate his trajectory, if you went back, it's gone. And I am guilty of that same kind of totally ludicrous snobbery about, well, I was here when. Even though, whenever I've been somewhere, there were people there at that time, even if it was 25 years ago, saying, well, you really should have been here 25 years before that time. So you know that you're never really there at the right moment. But what I loved about this book was that kind of capturing of those times and places. So I finished that. And then the book that I'm really reading, and I don't want to talk about it yet because I will be talking about it for many months, is Master of the Senate by Robert Caro, which is the 3rd volume of his Lyndon Johnson quintet to be. He's working on the 5th one, and he's coming out with a brief book this spring called Working, about his methodology, which I think was the impetus for finally turning to volume 3. I had read the first 2 books in the first one in high school. The second one I think I read in college. I remember the first one was one of the books that I chose when I joined up for the history book club. You remember that? It was like, yeah, super dork. And I think I was like in junior year of high school, and that was part of my package of 11 books for a penny or whatever in the first shipment. So it's been a long time since I read those first books, but you don't have to have read really the earlier volumes to enjoy this, and I'll explain more of that next time. What I want to say, though, is that I had the choice between paperback and hardcover, and I went for the hardcover with that Caro, which is a decision I don't regret, but the reason I made that decision was faulty, which is I thought if it were a hardcover, I would be able to carry it back and forth, and it wouldn't get all mussed up. In fact, it is so heavy. It is so heavy that it's going nowhere. I think it will still probably get messed up even just from being at home because I'll probably take a number of months to read it. But for that reason, I think I'm going to be doing 2 books at a time for quite a while. So I grabbed possibly the smallest book I could find to carry with me on my commute this week, and that is a little book by a British writer named Matt Haig, who is a big bestseller in the UK. This new book is called Notes on a Nervous Planet, and it just came out. Judith Newman reviewed it in her last self-help roundup, and we talked about it on the podcast a couple of weeks ago, which sort of piqued my interest. I know him mostly as the author of children's books. He also wrote a memoir about his suicidal depression.
He's also an adult novelist.
Yeah.
Yes.
He's very prolific, I guess.
He is. He wrote this children's book that I bought for my kids when I was in London once called To Be a Cat, which was from the cat's perspective. And all 3 of my children very much enjoyed that. And every time I sort of try to cycle it off their shelves, being like, you've read and reread this many times, let us move it on to the cousins. They want to hold on to that book. And this book is essentially a book where I agree with everything that he says. So it doesn't require like a lot of brain capacity because I just sit there nodding. And what it's about is about essentially the anxiety caused by social media and internet life in general. And he is an anxious person. He's like a diagnostically anxious person. So there's also the thing of like, he's far more anxious than me. And he's trying to contend with how you cope with that kind of anxiety when you're in a world that continually provokes it. There's also that nice thing about reading about someone who's like, is sort of taking this worse than you are in a way. I get that sense of smug superiority. Now, I'm joking, but but there is a kind of comfort to it.
Well, it's a sort of easing of your own anxiety. It could be worse, that kind of thing.
Yes. Judith quoted a few great bits in her review and in her podcast. But what she said was, he has some little nuggets of advice, like, don't be cool. Don't even try, be warm instead, which I know sounds like a Hallmark card, but it also is kind of true and nice. So that's what I'm reading. All right, let's go quickly. Lovia, what did you read this week?
A Brief History of 7 Killings by Marlon James.
Tina?
The Water Cure by Sophie McIntosh.
And John?
And I read Hold Still, a memoir with photographs by Sally Mann.
All right, and Notes on a Nervous Planet by Matt Haig. Thanks, guys.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Remember, there's more at nytimes.com/books, and you can always write to us at books@nytimes.com. I write back, albeit not right away. The Book Review Podcast is produced by Pedro Rosado from Headstepper Media, with the great help of my colleague, John Williams. Thanks for listening. For the New York Times, I'm Pamela Paul.